In the summer of 1852, a song drifted across the cotton fields of Beaufort County, South Carolina. To the overseers who heard it, the melody was nothing more than the mournful sound of labor, the expected music of people they considered property. But hidden within those notes was something that would terrify them if they understood: a map, a schedule, a promise of liberation. And the woman who sang it would guide more than 100 souls to freedom before anyone realized that her voice was the most dangerous weapon on the plantation. Before we journey deeper into this remarkable story of courage and cunning, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. These are the chapters of history that powerful people tried to erase, and together we are bringing them back to light. The woman's name was Ruth Celia, born on the Ashford plantation in 1824. She entered a world designed to break her spirit before she could understand she had one. Her mother, Dinah, had been sold away when Ruth was 4 years old, and her father, a man named Solomon, whose hands bore the permanent calluses of fieldwork, raised her with a secret knowledge that would one day change everything. Solomon understood something that the white owners of the Ashford plantation never suspected. He understood that music could carry meaning far beyond its melodies, that rhythm could encode information, that the very songs the enslavers allowed, even encouraged, could become the architecture of resistance. But Solomon died when Ruth was 16, taken by a fever that swept through the slave quarters during a bitter winter. Before he passed, he whispered something to his daughter that she would carry for the rest of her life. What exactly did Solomon tell Ruth in those final moments? The words Solomon spoke that night were simple but profound. The songs remember what we cannot say aloud. Learn them, change them, use them. And one day, daughter, you will sing people home. Ruth held her father's hand as his breathing slowed, and she made a promise she intended to keep. She would learn every song the elders knew. She would study every hidden meaning, every coded phrase, every subtle shift in rhythm that changed a spiritual from a prayer into a message. The Ashford plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Carolina lowcountry. Spanish moss draped from ancient live oaks, and the air hung thick with humidity that made every breath feel earned. The main house, a white-columned monument to stolen wealth, sat upon a small rise overlooking fields that stretched toward the distant tree line. Master William Ashford ran the plantation with the cold efficiency of a businessman who had convinced himself that efficiency absolved cruelty. His overseers, 3 men whose names the enslaved people spoke only in whispers, enforced his will through violence so casual it had become unremarkable. But within the slave quarters, a different world existed, a world the Ashfords never truly saw. Behind the walls of the small cabins, in the spaces between exhaustion and sleep, the enslaved community maintained traditions, passed down stories, and kept alive a flame of hope that their oppressors could not extinguish. Ruth became the keeper of songs. By 20, she knew more spirituals than anyone on the plantation. Her voice, a deep and resonant contralto, could carry across the fields during work and settle into intimate warmth during evening gatherings. The other enslaved people noticed that something happened when Ruth sang. The songs seemed to live differently in her mouth. What they didn't know was that Ruth had begun changing the songs. The changes were subtle at first. A word altered here, a phrase adjusted there. Ruth understood that the overseers listened, that any obvious code would be discovered and punished. So she developed a system so elegant in its simplicity that it hid in plain sight. The spirituals were built on images the enslavers recognized from their own religious practice: rivers, mountains, chariots, promised lands. The white owners heard these as proof that their enslaved workers had accepted Christianity and, by extension, their bondage. They encouraged the singing, believing it kept workers docile and grateful. They could not have been more wrong. Ruth began embedding specific meanings into specific songs. Wade in the Water became more than a spiritual about baptism. When Ruth sang it on a particular day, with particular emphasis on certain lines, it meant that patrollers would be active that night, that anyone planning movement should stay hidden and wait. Follow the Drinking Gourd, everyone knew pointed toward the North Star and freedom. But Ruth developed variations. A slight change in tempo indicated which routes were safe. An added verse, seemingly improvised, could name specific landmarks. A held note, longer than expected, was a warning. The genius of the system lay in its invisibility. Even if an overseer suspected something, how could he prove that a song was anything other than a song? Music left no physical evidence. It could not be confiscated or destroyed. It existed in the air and then vanished, carrying its secrets with those who understood. But Ruth's system would remain merely clever if she had no way to share it beyond the Ashford plantation. That changed when she met a man named Gabriel. Gabriel arrived at Ashford in the spring of 1849, purchased at a Charleston auction to replace workers lost to a typhoid outbreak. He was 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that held a quiet intensity that made the overseers uneasy. They assigned him to the most brutal fieldwork, hoping to break whatever spirit they sensed in him. They failed.
Gabriel had come from a plantation in Virginia where he'd learned to read in secret, taught by an elderly enslaved man who had once served in a wealthy household and had stolen literacy like the precious contraband it was. Gabriel could read, write, and do arithmetic. More importantly, he understood how information traveled between plantations, how the informal networks of the enslaved connected people across hundreds of miles. Ruth noticed Gabriel during the evening gatherings. He listened to her songs with an attention that went beyond appreciation. He seemed to be studying them, trying to understand something hidden within. After several weeks, he approached her. "You're doing something with those songs," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what, but I can hear it. There's a pattern." Ruth's heart raced. Discovery could mean death. But something in Gabriel's eyes told her that his interest was not that of an informant seeking favor with the masters. She saw recognition there, understanding. "What do you think I'm doing?" she asked carefully. Gabriel glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I think you're building a road that goes north, a road made of music." For the first time in years, Ruth allowed herself to smile. But their alliance would not remain secret for long. Over the following months, Ruth and Gabriel worked together to expand and refine the system. Gabriel's literacy allowed them to coordinate with enslaved people on neighboring plantations in ways that had previously been impossible. He could write messages that Ruth's songs would announce, creating a network that operated invisibly beneath the noses of their oppressors. They met in the late evenings, in the shadows behind the slave quarters, speaking in whispers that the night wind carried away. Gabriel taught Ruth to read, spending patient hours tracing letters in the dirt and then erasing them before dawn. Ruth taught Gabriel the intricacies of the song code, the subtle variations that transformed spirituals into tactical communications. Their collaboration was dangerous. The punishment for literacy among the enslaved was severe, sometimes fatal. And if anyone suspected what they were truly building, the consequences would be unimaginable. But they pressed forward. The first escape Ruth helped coordinate was a family of 4. Moses and Clara, along with their 2 children, had been marked for sale. Master Ashford had incurred gambling debts, and the family represented liquid assets he intended to liquidate. The children would be sold separately, the family shattered forever. Ruth sang "Steal Away" at the evening gathering, but with variations that Gabriel had taught her to embed. The song indicated a window of opportunity 3 nights hence, when the moon would be dark and the patrollers would be occupied with a gathering at a neighboring plantation. Moses understood. Clara understood. And when the moment came, the family vanished into the Carolina night, following routes that Ruth's songs had mapped over months of careful observation. 3 weeks later, word came through the underground network that the family had reached Philadelphia. Ruth and Gabriel had proven their system worked, but could they repeat it without being caught? They repeated it again and again. Through 1849 and into 1850, Ruth's songs guided 17 people to freedom. Each escape was meticulously planned, each detail encoded in melodies that the overseers dismissed as background noise. Gabriel coordinated with contacts on other plantations, creating a network that stretched from the Carolina Lowcountry to the Virginia border and beyond. Ruth developed new songs for new purposes. She created a spiritual about crossing the Jordan River that actually encoded information about crossing the Savannah River at specific points where the current was manageable. She composed a work song about following the sun that contained instructions for reading landmarks in the South Carolina swamps. The beauty of the system was its adaptability. Ruth could change meanings on the fly, adjusting codes when circumstances required. If patrollers discovered a particular route, she simply sang a variation that redirected travelers to alternatives. The music was infinitely flexible, as mutable as the air through which it traveled. But success bred danger. The Ashford plantation had lost nearly 20 enslaved people in a year and a half. Master William Ashford was furious. He hired additional patrollers, restricted movement between cabins after dark, and began watching the enslaved community with renewed suspicion. Whispers emerged of an informant, someone who was trading secrets for small privileges, someone willing to betray their own people for an extra portion of food or a less brutal work assignment. Ruth and Gabriel knew they needed to identify this person before their entire network was exposed. The hunt for the informant would lead them to a discovery more terrible than they had imagined. The informant was a woman named Patience, who worked in the main house as a domestic servant. She had been born on the Ashford plantation and had never known any other life. The relative comfort of housework, compared to the brutality of field labor, had made her desperate to maintain her position. When Master Ashford began asking questions about the disappearances, Patience saw an opportunity to secure her status. She had noticed that Ruth's songs seemed connected to the escapes. She couldn't prove it, couldn't understand the system, but she sensed a pattern. She told the overseer, a man named Crawford, about her suspicions. Crawford was a cruel man whose violence was legendary among the enslaved. He had killed workers before, always under circumstances officially recorded as accidents or justifiable punishment. The news that a woman was somehow organizing escapes through music intrigued him. If he could expose this network and present it to Master Ashford, his position would be secured for life. He began watching Ruth closely. Ruth noticed the increased attention, but didn't initially understand its source. Gabriel warned her to be careful, to change nothing about her routines. Any deviation would confirm suspicions that might otherwise remain merely theoretical. But events were moving faster than either of them realized. In February of 1851, a group of 6 enslaved people attempted to escape based on Ruth's coded instructions. But the patrol patterns had changed without Ruth's knowledge. Crawford had deliberately altered the schedules, telling no one, hoping to catch escapees and trace the network back to its source. The 6 were captured near the Savannah River. 3 were killed in the pursuit. The other 3 were returned to the plantation in chains. What followed was a horror that would haunt Ruth for the rest of her life. Crawford gathered the entire enslaved community to witness the punishment. The 3 survivors, 2 men and a woman named Josephine, were tied to posts in the yard before the main house. The message would be clear: escape meant death. Ruth stood among the forced witnesses, her face carefully blank, her heart screaming. She had sung these people toward freedom. Her songs had guided them into a trap. The whipping that followed was not merely punishment. It was torture designed to extract information. Crawford demanded to know who had organized the escape.
Who had told them when to run? Who had mapped their route? Josephine, even as the lash tore her flesh, said nothing. The two men, whose names were Isaac and Thomas, maintained their silence even as consciousness fled. They knew about Ruth. They had learned her songs, had understood her codes, and they chose to die rather than reveal her. When it was over, when the 3 broken bodies had been cut down and carried away, Ruth retreated to her cabin and collapsed. Gabriel found her there, trembling with grief and rage, her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle the sounds of her anguish. "They're dead because of me," she whispered. "My songs killed them." Gabriel knelt beside her, his voice firm but gentle. "No, Crawford killed them. The Ashfords killed them. This system killed them. You tried to save them. The trap was not of your making." But Ruth could not hear comfort. She could only hear the sounds of the lash, the silence of people who had protected her with their final breaths. For months afterward, Ruth did not sing. The silence was noticed. Without Ruth's songs, the evening gatherings lost something essential. The enslaved community felt the absence like a wound. Music had been their solace, their connection to something larger than daily brutality. Without it, hopelessness crept in. Gabriel watched Ruth retreat into herself and understood that forcing her to sing again would accomplish nothing. She had to find her own path back to the music, or the music would die with her spirit. Meanwhile, Crawford continued his investigation. He was convinced that Ruth was involved, but had no proof. The 3 who had died had given him nothing. Patience's suspicions remained merely suspicions, and without evidence, even Crawford couldn't simply execute a valuable piece of property. But he could make her life miserable. He reassigned Ruth from housework to field labor, the most brutal and exhausting work on the plantation. He separated her from Gabriel, sending him to work distant fields where they could rarely see each other. He watched her every movement, hoping she would make a mistake. Ruth endured. She bent her back to the work, let the sun burn her skin and the labor hollow her body. She survived because survival was its own form of resistance. Every day she lived was a day Crawford had not won. But she did not sing. 3 months passed. Spring arrived, bringing new planting and new exhaustion. And then something happened that changed everything once again. A new arrival came to the Ashford plantation. A young woman, barely more than a girl, purchased in Charleston to replace a domestic worker who had died of influenza. Her name was Mercy, and she carried a secret that would reignite Ruth's fire. Mercy was 15 years old, small and slight, with eyes that seemed too old for her face. She had been separated from her mother, sold away from a Virginia plantation when deaths forced a liquidation. She did not speak for the first week after her arrival, moving through her duties like a ghost, responding to orders with silent compliance. Ruth recognized the symptoms. Mercy was disappearing inside herself, retreating from a world too painful to engage. It was a common response to the trauma of sale and separation. Some people never returned from that internal exile. But Ruth saw something else in Mercy, something familiar. The girl hummed while she worked. Not songs exactly, but fragments of melodies, pieces of spirituals that Ruth recognized. One evening, Ruth approached Mercy in the yard behind the slave quarters. The girl tensed, expecting trouble, but Ruth's presence held no threat. "Those songs you hum," Ruth said quietly, "where did you learn them?" Mercy looked at Ruth with wary eyes. "My mother taught me, before they sold me." "Your mother? What was her name?" A pause, a painful swallowing of emotion. "Her name was Sarah, Sarah from the Morgan plantation in Virginia." Ruth felt something shift in her chest. She had heard of Sarah. Through the network Gabriel had built, she had learned of a woman in Virginia who was doing something similar to what Ruth did in South Carolina. A woman who encoded messages in music and guided people north. "Did your mother teach you what the songs mean?" Ruth asked carefully. "The hidden meanings?" Mercy's eyes widened. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, "You know about the meanings?" Ruth nodded. And Mercy, for the first time since her arrival, began to cry. The connection between Ruth and Mercy became a lifeline for both. Ruth learned that Sarah, Mercy's mother, had developed a system remarkably similar to her own, hundreds of miles away. The songs traveled, it seemed, and so did their secrets. Different women in different places had independently discovered the same revolutionary truth. Music could be weaponized against oppression. Mercy carried songs Ruth had never heard, with codes Ruth had never imagined. And Ruth carried knowledge that could help Mercy understand the larger network of resistance that stretched across the South. Together, they began to rebuild what Crawford's trap had destroyed. But they worked differently now, more carefully. Ruth understood that the enemy was watching, that any mistake could be fatal. She developed new codes, more subtle than before. Songs that could be interpreted innocently, that held their secrets so deeply embedded that only those who knew exactly what to listen for could understand. Gabriel, despite being separated from Ruth during work hours, found ways to communicate. Messages passed through trusted intermediaries. Information flowed through channels that Crawford could not see. And slowly, carefully, the network began to function again. By the summer of 1851, Ruth was singing once more. Her voice, tempered by grief and hardened by experience, carried something new. Not just hope, but determination. Not just sorrow, but resolve. Crawford noticed that Ruth had resumed singing, but could detect nothing suspicious in her melodies. The songs seemed simpler now, more innocent. Just spirituals, just the expected music of labor. He didn't realize that Ruth had elevated her craft to an entirely new level. The first successful escape after Ruth's return was a man named Ezekiel, who had been crippled by an accident in the mill. Master Ashford had decided that a crippled slave was more liability than asset, and intended to sell him, likely to someone who would work him to death despite his injury. Ruth sang Ezekiel a song that told him exactly when to leave, exactly which path to follow, exactly where he would find people waiting to help him continue north. The song was disguised as a lamentation about crossing Jordan, but every phrase contained tactical information. Ezekiel vanished on a moonless night and was never recaptured. Crawford was furious. Another escape under his increased surveillance. He interrogated the enslaved community brutally, but no one admitted to knowing anything. And how could they? Ruth's songs had left no evidence. There was nothing to find. 2 more escapes followed, then 3 more. By the end of 1851, Ruth had guided another 14 people to freedom, all under Crawford's watchful eye. He suspected her intensely, but could prove nothing. The suspicion ate at him. He began losing sleep, his temper growing even more volatile. His violence toward the enslaved workers increased. Random beatings delivered to anyone who gave him the slightest reason. Ruth understood that Crawford was becoming dangerous in unpredictable ways. A man humiliated by his failures, a man convinced of conspiracy but unable to prove it, was capable of anything. She needed to be careful, but she also needed to continue. Every day, people suffered under this system. Every day, families were destroyed, bodies were broken, spirits were crushed. She could not stop because one man was watching. The question was whether she could keep singing long enough to make a real difference. The answer came from an unexpected direction. In early 1852, word reached the Ashford plantation through Gabriel's network that a major operation was being planned. something larger than individual escapes or small groups, something that would involve coordinated action across multiple plantations simultaneously. The Underground Railroad, that informal network of safe houses and sympathetic helpers stretching from the south to the north, was preparing its most ambitious effort. A mass exodus, timed to coincide with specific circumstances that would maximize the chances of success. Ruth's role would be critical. Her songs would coordinate the timing across the Carolina plantations. Other singers in other locations would do the same. The music would be the synchronizing mechanism, ensuring that dozens of people would move simultaneously, overwhelming the ability of patrollers to respond. The plan was audacious. It was also incredibly dangerous. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Ruth considered the risks. She thought about Josephine, Isaac, and Thomas, who had died because of her songs. She thought about the grief that still haunted her nights. She thought about Crawford's watching eyes and Patience's betrayal. And then she thought about Mercy, about the young woman whose mother had independently discovered the same truth Ruth knew. She thought about all the mothers separated from their children, all the families shattered, all the lives stolen by this monstrous system. She made her decision. She would sing. She would coordinate the exodus. And if she died doing it, she would die knowing she had fought. But first, she needed to eliminate the threat that Crawford represented. Gabriel proposed a plan that Ruth initially rejected as too dangerous. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood it was their only option. Crawford would be removed from the equation, not through violence that would bring retribution, but through something more elegant. He would be discredited, disgraced, and expelled from the plantation in a way that left no suspicion falling on the enslaved community. The plan required precise timing and considerable risk. It also required using Patience, the informant, without her knowledge.
Gabriel had discovered that Crawford was embezzling from Master Ashford. Small amounts, carefully hidden, but traceable if someone knew where to look. Crawford's greed had outpaced his caution, and he had left evidence that could destroy him. The challenge was getting that evidence to Master Ashford in a way that seemed organic, that didn't appear to come from the enslaved community. That was where Patience became useful. Gabriel arranged for Patience to accidentally discover documents that Crawford had carelessly left unsecured. The documents clearly showed the embezzlement. Patience, eager to maintain her position and please her masters, immediately reported her discovery to Master Ashford. The reaction was everything they had hoped for. Master Ashford, who tolerated cruelty toward his enslaved workers but would not tolerate theft of his money, confronted Crawford in a fury. The overseer attempted to explain, to deny, to redirect blame, but the evidence was irrefutable. Within a week, Crawford was dismissed. He left the plantation in disgrace, his reputation destroyed. He would never work as an overseer again. Ruth sang that night for the first time in months with pure joy. The enemy who had watched her, who had murdered people she loved, was gone. But the exodus was still coming, and new dangers awaited. The date was set for September 14, 1852. A Saturday night when patrollers would be occupied with their own weekend activities. A night without moonlight when darkness would provide maximum cover. A night when the songs would coordinate the largest mass escape in Carolina history. Ruth spent the weeks leading up to the date preparing. She taught new songs to trusted members of the community, songs that contained instructions for those who would be leaving. She established signals that would indicate whether the operation was proceeding or should be aborted. She planned for contingencies, for unexpected obstacles, for the 1,000 things that could go wrong. Mercy became her primary assistant. The young woman had proven herself capable and intelligent, with a memory that could retain complex codes and subtle variations. She learned Ruth's entire system and would be able to continue the work if something happened to Ruth. Gabriel coordinated with contacts across the region. The network was alive with preparation. In Virginia, in Georgia, in North Carolina, other groups were making their own arrangements. The simultaneous action would create chaos that no patrol system could contain. But as the date approached, Ruth felt a weight of responsibility that threatened to crush her. So many people were depending on her songs. So many lives hung on whether she got the codes right, whether she sang the variations correctly, whether the information reached everyone who needed it. The night before the exodus, she barely slept. She lay in her cabin, watching darkness press against the window, thinking about everything that could go wrong.
Gabriel found her before dawn. "Are you ready?" Ruth looked at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. "I've been ready my entire life. I just didn't know it until now." The day of the Exodus arrived. The morning of September 14th dawned clear and hot. Ruth went through her normal routines, giving no indication that anything unusual was planned. She worked in the fields, her body performing familiar motions while her mind reviewed every detail of the coming night. As the afternoon progressed, she began to sing. The songs seemed ordinary, just the expected music of labor. But woven through the melodies were final instructions, confirmation that the operation was proceeding, signals that those who were leaving should prepare. 37 people on the Ashford plantation were planning to escape that night. They ranged from families with children to elderly individuals who would rather die free than live another year in bondage. They had been preparing for weeks, hiding supplies, memorizing routes, saying silent goodbyes to those who would stay behind. Ruth's songs told them that the moment was coming. As evening approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Every unexpected sound seemed like a warning. Every unfamiliar figure in the distance seemed like a patroller. The weight of expectation pressed down on everyone involved. Ruth gathered with the community for the evening prayer meeting, a regular occurrence that the overseers tolerated because it seemed to keep the workers docile. But tonight, the prayers would serve a different purpose. Ruth stood among her people and opened her mouth to sing. The song that emerged was unlike anything she had ever performed. It was a synthesis of everything she had learned, every code she had developed, every secret meaning she had embedded in melodies over years of work. It was a road made of music, a map of sound, a promise carried on the evening air. Those who would stay listened and understood that they were witnessing something historic. Those who would leave listened and received their final instructions. And then, as night fell, the exodus began. They moved in small groups, filtering into the darkness at timed intervals. Ruth's songs had specified the exact sequence, the gaps between departures, the routes each group would take. The coordination was precise, designed to prevent any single capture from compromising the entire operation. Ruth did not go with them. Her role was to stay, to continue singing, to provide cover. If she vanished along with the others, the connection would be immediately obvious. But if she remained, if she continued her normal routines, the confusion would persist. Who had organized this? How had they coordinated? The questions would remain unanswered. Gabriel left with the first group, leading them through terrain he had scouted over months of careful preparation. Before departing, he found Ruth in the shadows behind the slave quarters.
"Come with us," he said. "You've done enough. Let someone else carry the burden now." Ruth shook her head. "The songs need a singer, and there are more people here who need to escape. The work isn't done." "It will never be done," Gabriel said. "Not in our lifetimes. Maybe not in our children's lifetimes. You've given everything you can." "I've given everything except my life," Ruth replied. "And that I'm willing to give too, if it means more people reach freedom." They embraced in the darkness, knowing it might be the last time. Then Gabriel disappeared into the night, following the road Ruth's songs had built. Ruth returned to her cabin and waited for dawn. The morning brought chaos. The overseers discovered the empty cabins, the missing workers, the magnitude of the exodus. 37 people gone, vanished as if they had never existed. Master Ashford raged. He sent riders in every direction, organized patrollers, offered rewards. But the escapees had too much of a head start, too good a plan, too many allies waiting along the way. In the days that followed, reports filtered back. Small groups had been spotted in the Savannah River area. Tracks had been found heading north. But no one was captured. The coordination had been too effective, the routes too carefully chosen, the timing too perfect. The loss devastated the Ashford plantation economically. 37 workers represented an enormous financial blow. But for Ruth, watching from her position of careful innocence, the loss represented something else entirely: freedom. 37 people whose lives would never again be controlled by the Ashfords. 37 people who would eventually reach places where they could live as human beings rather than property. 37 people whose children and grandchildren would know liberty because Ruth had sung them a road. She allowed herself a small, private moment of triumph. But she knew the danger was not over. Suspicion fell on everyone who remained. The investigation was brutal. Beatings, interrogations, threats. The new overseer, a man named Morrison who had replaced Crawford, was determined to discover how the escape had been organized. Ruth endured the interrogations with practiced calm. She had prepared for this. Her story was simple and consistent. She knew nothing. She had seen nothing. She had slept through the night like everyone else and awakened to discover the empty cabins, just like the overseers. Morrison believed her, or at least couldn't prove otherwise. The songs left no evidence. Life on the Ashford plantation continued, diminished but persistent. Master Ashford purchased new workers to replace those who had escaped, creating fresh opportunities for Ruth's underground work. The Exodus had demonstrated what was possible. Others now approached Ruth, asking to learn her songs, asking for guidance toward freedom. Mercy became Ruth's primary assistant and eventual successor.
The young woman had a gift for the work, an ability to craft codes and embed meanings that rivaled Ruth's own. Together, they refined the system, making it even more invisible, even more effective. Over the following years, Ruth guided another 68 people to freedom. Some escaped individually, slipping away in the night following roads her songs had mapped. Others left in small groups during moments of opportunity. A few escaped during the confusion of major events, sales or deaths or transitions that created chaos the enslaved community could exploit. Each escape was a victory. Each person who reached the North was a testament to the power of resistance, to the courage of ordinary people refusing to accept their oppression. But Ruth paid a price. The constant danger, the weight of responsibility, the grief of those who didn't make it, all of it accumulated. She aged rapidly, her hair graying before its time, her face developing lines that spoke of burdens carried too long. Gabriel sent word when he could. He had reached Canada, had established himself in a community of escaped slaves in Ontario. He begged Ruth to join him, to finally claim her own freedom after giving so much for others. She always refused. The work was not done. The songs still had people to guide. The breaking point came in 1857. A young man named Isaiah, whom Ruth had been preparing for escape, was captured before he could even begin his journey. An informant, someone new who had been purchased recently and who turned to betrayal to secure his position, had revealed Isaiah's plans.
Isaiah was beaten nearly to death. He survived, but his legs were so damaged he would never walk properly again. He would spend the rest of his life on the Ashford plantation, a visible reminder of what happened to those who tried to escape. Ruth sang at the evening gathering that night, her voice steady even as her heart shattered. She sang Isaiah's favorite spiritual, a song about crossing over Jordan, knowing he would never make that crossing now. But something changed in her voice that night. Those who listened heard it, though they couldn't name it. A quality that went beyond sorrow, beyond anger, beyond even determination. It was the sound of someone who had made a decision. Ruth was going to escape herself. After years of guiding others to freedom, she was finally going to claim her own. But she wasn't going alone. She was going to lead the largest single exodus the Ashford plantation had ever seen. Mercy tried to dissuade her. "You're too valuable here. Your songs have saved more than 100 people. If you leave, who will sing them toward freedom?" Ruth looked at her young protege with eyes that held no doubt. "You will. I've taught you everything I know. The songs will continue through you and through everyone you teach. But I need to see freedom myself, Mercy. I need to know what it feels like to wake up in a place where no one owns me." The planning began immediately. Ruth spent 3 months preparing for her final operation. She coordinated with the network Gabriel had maintained from Canada, arranging for assistance at key points along the route. She identified the 23 people who would escape with her, carefully selecting those who were strong enough for the journey and trusted enough to keep the secret. She composed new songs for this specific escape, melodies that contained everything they would need to know about routes, timing, dangers, and resources. She taught these songs to the 23, drilling them until the information was as natural as breathing. Mercy would stay behind to maintain the network, to continue the work Ruth had begun. The transition was painful but necessary. Every movement needs continuation. Every struggle requires those who carry on when the founders can no longer continue. The date was set for October 3, 1857, a night of no moon, a weekend when patrols would be reduced, a moment when the network was fully prepared to receive them. Ruth spent her final day on the Ashford plantation in a strange state of calm. She walked the familiar paths she had known her entire life. She touched the walls of the cabin where she had been born, where her father had died, where she had first begun to understand the power of music. She said silent goodbyes to places that had been both prison and home. As evening approached, she gathered with the community for what would be her last prayer meeting. The people who were leaving knew the significance. The people who were staying sensed that something momentous was happening, even if they didn't know exactly what. Ruth opened her mouth and began to sing. The song that emerged was her masterpiece. It contained not just the codes and instructions for that night's escape, but something larger, a summation of everything Ruth had learned about resistance, about courage, about the human capacity to endure the unendurable and still find ways to fight. Those who heard it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Years later, when the Civil War had ended and slavery was finally abolished, survivors of that night would speak of Ruth's final song with tears in their eyes. It had been, they would say, the most beautiful thing they had ever heard. When the song ended, night had fully fallen. The 23 began filtering out of the slave quarters, following the routes Ruth's music had mapped. Ruth was the last to leave, taking one final look at the place that had shaped her entire existence. Then she turned and vanished into the darkness. The journey north took 7 weeks. They traveled by night, hid by day, evaded patrollers, crossed rivers, traversed swamps, and relied on the network of safe houses and sympathetic helpers that formed the Underground Railroad. Ruth led them with the same precision she had brought to everything she did. She had mapped this route in her mind 1,000 times.
She knew every landmark, every danger, every resource. And when obstacles appeared, when plans had to change, she improvised with the same creativity that had allowed her to embed maps in melodies. There were close calls, moments when discovery seemed inevitable. But Ruth's songs continued even in flight, whispered communications that kept the group coordinated, that warned of dangers ahead, that encouraged those whose strength was failing. One by one, they reached the checkpoints. One by one, they crossed into free states. And finally, on November 21, 1857, 24 people, including Ruth herself, crossed the border into Canada. Gabriel was waiting for her. He had aged, his hair now gray at the temples, but his eyes still held that quiet intensity Ruth had first noticed 8 years earlier. They embraced without words, holding each other as the cold Canadian wind swept around them. "You made it," Gabriel said finally. "After all these years, you finally made it." Ruth looked around at the small community of escaped slaves who had gathered to welcome the new arrivals. She saw faces that had known bondage and now knew freedom. She saw children who would never be sold away from their parents. She saw people building lives on their own terms. "I made it," she agreed, "but the songs didn't stop at the border. They're still being sung back home. Mercy will teach others. Others will teach more. The road I built doesn't end with me." She was right. The song codes Ruth developed spread through the South in the years that followed. Other enslaved people learned the system, adapted it, passed it on. When the Civil War began, the communication networks Ruth had helped establish became crucial for passing information about troop movements, escape opportunities, and the progress of Union forces. Ruth lived until 1891, dying peacefully in her home in Ontario at the age of 67. She had spent her years in freedom, teaching school, singing in church, and writing down everything she remembered about the song code system. Her manuscripts, discovered after her death, provided historians with unprecedented insight into the secret communication methods of the enslaved. The story of Ruth Celia should be better known than it is. Her innovations in encoding information within music represented a form of resistance so elegant that it remained invisible to those it opposed. The songs she developed and taught helped hundreds of people reach freedom, and the methods she pioneered continued to be used long after she herself had escaped. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ruth's story is what it reveals about the nature of oppression and resistance. The enslavers believed they controlled everything: the bodies of the enslaved, their labor, their families, even their voices. They allowed the singing because they thought it was evidence of contentment, proof that their human property had accepted its fate. They could not have been more wrong. Ruth understood that the oppressor's certainty was their weakness. Their confidence that they knew what the songs meant, that they understood the enslaved people they claimed to own, created a blind spot large enough to hide a revolution. She exploited that blind spot with brilliance and courage, transforming the very music her captors encouraged into a weapon against their system. The songs Ruth sang still echo today. Not just literally in the spirituals that remain part of American culture, but in the principle they embodied. That resistance can take forms the oppressor cannot recognize. That creativity can be revolutionary. That even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to assert its dignity and fight for freedom. As we close this story, I want to reflect on what Ruth, Celia, and all those who resisted slavery teach us about the human capacity for courage. These were people facing overwhelming odds, brutal violence, and a system designed to crush their spirits completely. They had every reason to surrender, to accept their fate, to simply survive as best they could. But they chose to fight. Not with armies or weapons, but with intelligence, creativity, and an unbreakable determination to be free. They built networks, developed codes, and risked everything for the chance at liberty. Ruth turned songs into roads. She made music into maps. She transformed the very culture her oppressors thought they understood into a secret language of resistance. And in doing so, she demonstrated that human beings can never truly be owned, that the spirit cannot be chained, even when the body is bound. The songs remember. They carry the courage of those who sang them, the hope of those who listened, the determination of those who followed their secret roads to freedom. They remind us that ordinary people facing extraordinary evil can find extraordinary ways to resist. Ruth Celia was born into slavery. She died free. And the road she built from song and courage led hundreds of others to the same destination. That is her legacy. That is what the songs remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most remarkable stories of resistance and courage. If this story moved you, if Ruth's courage inspired you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We explore forgotten chapters of history every week, bringing to light the stories that powerful people tried to suppress. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most about Ruth's story, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another secret that history tried to hide. Until then, remember, the songs remember, and as long as we listen, the road to freedom remains open. What you have just heard is a dramatization inspired by the historical reality of how enslaved African Americans used spirituals and coded songs to communicate information related to escape on the Underground Railroad.
While Ruth Celia is a fictional character, the methods she employed are based on documented historical practices. The courage and creativity of enslaved people who developed these communication systems represent one of the most remarkable examples of resistance in American history. The landscape of memory stretches across centuries, connecting us to those who came before. In the fields of South Carolina, in the swamps of Georgia, in the hidden routes that wound toward freedom, songs once carried secrets that could mean the difference between bondage and liberty. Ruth understood this power intuitively, as did the many others who developed and shared coded communication through music. They understood that their oppressors, in their arrogance, could not imagine that the people they enslaved were capable of such sophisticated resistance. That failure of imagination became the opening through which freedom flowed. The spirituals we know today, songs like Wade in the Water, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Follow the Drinking Gourd, carry echoes of this history. When we hear them now, we hear not just beautiful music, but the memory of people who refused to be broken, who found ways to fight even when fighting seemed impossible. Ruth's final song, the one she sang on the night of her own escape, was never written down. It exists only in the memories of those who heard it, and they are long gone now. But in a sense, every spiritual that survived carries something of that song within it. Every melody that once pointed toward the North Star, every rhythm that once encoded a warning, every harmony that once offered hope in the midst of despair, all of these are Ruth's children. The road she built still exists, not as a physical path through Carolina Low Country, but as a principle, a possibility, a proof that the human spirit cannot be permanently suppressed. Every act of resistance, every assertion of dignity, every refusal to accept oppression as permanent, follows the road Ruth and others like her constructed from nothing but music and courage. In the community where Ruth spent her final years, children would gather to hear her stories. She would tell them about the plantation, about the songs, about the nights of escape and the days of hiding. She would explain how music could carry meaning, how voices could be weapons, how creativity could be revolution. And sometimes, when the telling was done, she would sing for them, old spirituals adapted for a new life and freedom. The codes no longer mattered, the secret meanings no longer necessary. But the songs remained beautiful, filled with the pain and hope and determination of all those who had sung them in bondage. The children would listen,
not fully understanding what their grandmother or neighbor or friend had survived, not yet able to comprehend the magnitude of what she had done. But the songs stayed with them. They passed them to their own children, who passed them further still.
This is how memory works. This is how history survives. Not in monuments or official records, though those have their place, but in the living transmission of story and song, from voice to voice, generation to generation, an unbroken chain connecting past to future. Ruth Celia built a road of music, and that road still leads somewhere, still carries meaning, still offers hope. The songs remember. They always remember. As the years of freedom accumulated, Ruth found a peace that had eluded her during the decades of bondage and resistance. She had time now to simply exist, to wake each morning knowing the day was her own, to sleep each night without fear of what tomorrow might bring. But she never forgot those she had left behind. Every year, as long as the Underground Railroad operated, she sent what support she could. Money when she had it, information always, encouragement always. She maintained connections with the network, offering guidance to new conductors who were continuing the work. And she continued to compose songs. Not coded songs anymore, not secret communications, but songs of celebration, of mourning, of remembrance. Songs for the children born in freedom who needed to understand what their parents and grandparents had survived. Songs for the elders who had never made the journey north and had died in bondage. Songs for everyone who had been part of the struggle, whether they had reached freedom or not. One of these songs became particularly well known in the community. It was called The Road Remembers, and it told the story of all those who had traveled the secret paths to freedom. The melody was haunting, building from a quiet beginning to a triumphant conclusion. The words spoke of suffering transformed into strength, of bondage transformed into liberty, of the unbreakable connection between those who had traveled the road and those who would come after. Ruth sang this song at community gatherings for decades. It became a tradition, expected at every significant celebration, a way of honoring the past while embracing the present. When Ruth finally passed away in 1891, the community sang it at her funeral. Hundreds of voices joined in the melody she had created, sending her spirit home with the music that had defined her life. The historical record of the song code system is fragmentary but fascinating. Scholars have documented numerous instances of spirituals being used to communicate information about escape routes, patrol schedules, and safe houses. The full extent of this practice will never be known, precisely because it was designed to be invisible to those it opposed. But we know enough to understand that what Ruth did in our story represents something that actually happened, repeatedly, across the slave-holding South. Enslaved people developed sophisticated systems of coded communication, using the very cultural forms their oppressors encouraged against the system of oppression itself. This represents resistance at its most creative and its most courageous. Not dramatic confrontation, which would have been suicidal, not passive acceptance, which would have been surrender, but subtle, intelligent, persistent undermining of the system from within, using whatever tools were available. The tools Ruth had were her voice, her intelligence, and her courage. She used them to build something that changed lives, that struck blows against an evil system, that demonstrated the irrepressible nature of the human desire for freedom. Her example speaks across the centuries to everyone who faces oppression in any form. It says, "Look for the blind spots. Find the tools they have not thought to take from you. Build networks of trust. Pass information in ways they cannot detect. Never stop fighting, even when fighting seems impossible." The songs remember, and as long as we remember the songs, Ruth's road remains open. In closing, I want to return to the image with which we began. A woman's voice rising over cotton fields in the summer of 1852. A melody that seems like nothing more than the music of labor. But hidden within, a map,
a schedule, a promise of freedom. Ruth Celia turned secret songs into a road to freedom. She did it with courage, with intelligence, with creativity, and with an unbreakable determination that no amount of oppression could crush. She demonstrated that the human spirit, even in the darkest circumstances, finds ways to assert itself, to resist, to hope. Her road stretched from the Carolina Lowcountry to the freedom of Canada. But in a larger sense, it stretches from the 19th century to today. It reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms. It reminds us that the desire for freedom is universal and indestructible. The songs still echo, the road still leads somewhere. And Ruth Celia, who was born in bondage and died in freedom, still has something to teach us about courage, about creativity, and about the human capacity to transform suffering into strength. Listen carefully. You might just hear her singing still.